Mr. Mkhwanazi to come in and give us their perspective as Saki. And I must tell you, Mr. Mkhwanazi, I got an SMS today from one of the leaders in government saying they hope that business will come with actionable action plans of what and how we're going to accelerate the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I'm looking forward to that very excitedly. And then welcome, sir. So Mr. Mkhwanazi, please give us some introductory remarks and then we will take it from there. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, and good evening to all our guests and listeners. If we may just ask people who are not speaking to simply look at their devices and mute. We're getting a lot of feedback from participants who have not muted their phones. Someone is busy shuffling some paper, moving cabinets and furniture and everything. Thank you so much. Well, so Ronny, thank you so much to Mkhwanazi Incorporated for having put together this particular session. The issue of the Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very significant development for us as South Africans, the South African economy, as well as the rest of the continent. So we welcome this particular initiative, and hopefully we will have a very interesting engagement over the next hour or so in trying to have a look at some of the challenging aspects of how we, as the South African Chamber, certainly have seen the world and why we think the continent is so critical and so important, especially to try and drive the agenda for change and development across many of the aspects, including on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and a whole range of the issues around the competitive landscape and what it is that we believe should actually happen as a contextual framework to put together the resources that we need and how we can create an equitous environment to assist the development of Africa as a continent, which happens to be the richest continent in the world, which has not yet fulfilled its promise. The potential is there. And so we'll share some of those ideas that we have from our own perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm already excited by that. Your Excellency, please unmute yourself, sir, Your Excellency. Just unmute. If you can just unmute yourself. Can you hear us, sir? Oh, there we go. I think
Can you hear me now?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Your Excellency. Yes, we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mkhwanazi. I'm also very glad to be here. I remember the historical time when the process was signed in Kigali, immediately by 44 countries out of the 54 African countries. And today we are happy that 30 countries out of 54 have completed the ratification, and the CFTA is, has reached the effectiveness time, and the Secretariat is in Ghana. What I can say is that in the past, Africa used to complain that we produce raw material for others, we sell them cheaply, and we were not even trading among ourselves. We were not even borrowing a leaf from each other on how to negotiate, how to create a one voice, even how to pool the skills, the money that we have in the continent in order to be competitive, in order to have a common voice, in order also to create wealth within, so that we position ourselves as a relevant partner, as a relevant continent. If the Europeans who colonized us operate as a group of EU, why shall we continue to act individually, knowingly that we have a lot of shortages and weaknesses? But by coming together, I believe the standards, the competitiveness will increase, and also circulations of goods and capital within the continent that will boost on the quality and the negotiating capacity. So this is a great opportunity that both government and private sector shall continue to support, and to ensure all the processes and procedures and negotiations move fast, even though by this time the COVID has kind of impeded on each and everything, but it's also an opportunity to rethink on how we do business. Things that were familiar to use by traveling can be now happen like this event where we are meeting without meeting. So even in the CFTA, IT is crucial, is critical. So that requires countries to improve on their connectivity, on their policies, on IT and e-commerce and so on. And as you said rightly, even e-commerce is part of the different protocols that are being discussed and so on. So I think I will stop there and let the audience debate or chip in as well. Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Okay, thank you so much, Your Excellency, and congratulations as well on what happened last week in Kinshasa. I saw your video on YouTube. I was very impressed by the pomp and ceremony that goes with presenting yourself to the president of the country. So congratulations on that. Okay, what I'm going to do now, Mr. Mkhwanazi, I'm going to hand over the stage to you. And in particular, what we were saying is, if you remember the topic, it talks about accelerating the AfCFTA. And a perspective from business. In fact, the role that business is going to play in that regard. So I'm really, really keen on hearing your views on this. And I think everybody on this platform is excited to hear this. Because for me, for example, I have attended many of this, whether it's AfCFTA or SADC or, all those developmental organizational meetings, whether it be seminars and so forth. And most of the time, I remember, in fact, in one of the BRICS summits, I stood up and asked the question, but where is business? Because you have all the summits, that are being attended by government leaders, government officials, trade officials within the state. But the reality is that business needs to then translate that into action. I mean, if you just think in a South African environment, we have, I can imagine, hundreds, if not thousands, of bilateral agreements that we've signed with many countries, but we don't know what happens to them. They get signed, they get put in a shelf somewhere, they're forgotten about. After a new, government comes in, the same process is being repeated. So I feel there's a disconnect between, a government, which is the enabler, for business to operate, and business, which is the engine of making sure that our economies work. So please, Mr. Mkhwanazi, take the stage. Tell us what you think about this. Tell us what type of actions you as business would like to see firstly happening, but also are going to participate and do to make sure that we don't waste any more time insofar as implementing the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So with those few words, the stage is yours. We're excitedly waiting for your input. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that very strong introduction. And I think that perhaps maybe we had a prepared presentation, we'll go to it, but we'll try as well to deal with quite a number of the aspects of what you have raised. You are quite correct that in a number of cases we can have bilateral trade agreements. We've signed these things all the time. The participants would be the civil service, maybe the government people, and business sometimes lags behind. And yet business is the one that tends to complain a lot about the lack of action in that particular regard. I think that level of disconnect is caused by a series of things, and I will try and deal with some of those things as a contextual framework, why we sometimes tend to see the disconnect, and so that we do not make the same mistake as it comes to dealing with this new initiative, which is a very powerful initiative, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, as it has the potential to create massive opportunities to unleash the economic power of Africa in a way that is sustainable for hundreds of years to come. But we should not make sure that we all say the same things, that we sing from the same hymn book, and that we actually do understand that these are the challenges that we face. and that we do a proper diagnostic in understanding the problems, because sometimes we rush to solutions, but we did not actually understand the problem and diagnose the problem specifically to understand the root cause of why certain other things happen the way they do. So maybe if I may start, Ronny, from the point I always talk about the 4 Ps. In other words, I always say that it's people, it's purpose, it's politics, and it's policy. Not in any order, but you can put an order if you wish. As I repeat, it's people, it's purpose, it's politics, and it's policy. Those things need to be in sync, and they all need to work together. And why do I say that? It's because purpose is everything. In other words, purpose tells you your direction, purpose articulates your vision in respect of why you're doing the things that you need to do, and purpose gives you a sense of what the short, medium, and long-term objectives should be. It is us as Africans, number one, to overlay as a foundation the concept of what does a free trade agreement mean. Early this morning, we're at the Zambia South Africa Investment Conference, and one of the speakers from Zambia was making this accusation, which some people have said is fair. I didn't think that it is, that some of the South African countries would view this as South Africa basically using intelligent dumping, where we want to use markets elsewhere to dump South African products and kill the opportunity for those particular countries to industrialize and to build their own manufacturing capabilities. And my response to that was that that cannot be a correct position for South Africa itself, because it is not in the interest of South Africa to have, e.g., a Zambia that is weak, that is a much more lower rate of growth, because what South Africa needs for its own development is a Zambia that is growing, whose economic development is certain, where incomes are growing, where GDP per capita is growing, because only when the Zambians have money can they buy goods from South Africa. Only when Zambians have money can South African capital get into Zambia to make a return. A country that is not succeeding is not a very good market for anyone. And it's not a competitive environment in which you can go and say, I can go there and put plant and equipment and do fixed domestic investment. So from a principle point of view, we all need to understand and go back to this point that I was making earlier on about purpose, is that South Africa, for instance, has its own national development plan. We need to have, and I said the same thing earlier on, we need to have our own regional or continental development plan. What is this that we are all trying to achieve, okay? In the last 200 years, less than 8 non-Western countries have moved from developing to developed economies. And you count amongst those particular countries, places like South Korea, Taiwan, the old Hong Kong, of course, Singapore, Russia, Australia, and places like that, and Israel. So we need to then figure a way of understanding what are these building blocks that were needed or required to move those countries from developing to developed. Because if we do not develop African economies to becoming developed economies, none of the things that we're discussing here today around the free trade agreement are actually going to take us. A similar template, we need to all see the same hymn book in doing the same things. In other words, understanding that the objectives are actually the same. So if we say we are now going to focus on manufacturing sector in particular areas, beneficiation of platinum or beneficiation of copper, of all the minerals that we have in the African continent, we need to have a very clear plan that we're going to put it together. That will be driven by both the politics and the policies that we're able to enact. Because if we do not get to that particular point, I'm afraid many of the things that we plan to do will not actually be done. Business by its very nature invests in 2 things. Business invests in values and business invests in competencies. In other words, what are the necessary competencies that you can display as an investment destination for me to come and plant my capital in your country? That's the first point. Number two, what are the values that govern your behavior, your attitudes, your habits, the way you do your legislation, the way you do your criminal justice system, the nature of your constitutional arrangements around institutions that bolster that constitutional state. Can I sue someone if I invest money in the DRC? Am I certain in my head that my business partner in the DRC is not related to the judge of the High Court, and the judge of the High Court does not operate with the right principles, so therefore he will actually be susceptible to a bribe or whatever the case might be, and give a decision that has nothing to do with the law but everything to do with self-interest? These are all things that are in the value system. When we say the principles of engagement, what are these things that we find in a particular investment destination that makes us to have that level of assurance that we think that that particular place is making sense from a governance point of view throughout the arrangements that happen to be there from a business point of view as well as from the. So that level of consistency is something that is critical and very important at all times when we deal with that particular issue in terms of how do you invest money in those particular areas. Equity, South Africa country in Africa, you cannot do the continental free trade agreement when you've got this problem of asymmetry. A couple of years ago, we signed the Zambia Chamber of Commerce and South African Chamber of Commerce MOU, and the keynote was the then Minister for Trade, Industry and Commerce in Zambia, Minister Margaret. And one of the points that she made in the keynote that I recall very well, she said, did you know that, number one, Zambia has got almost 40% of the entire water resource of the SADC region, and yet 80% of that water ends up in the Indian Ocean as waste. Number two, she was in a hurry to go back. She was in a hurry to go back. She was in a hurry to go back to Lusaka because she was going to go and open a builder's warehouse in Lusaka. And she said, I can guarantee you now that more than 80% of the goods that will be sold at that builder's warehouse would actually be imported from South Africa because all of them would be manufactured in South Africa. It is not the type of free trade that we're looking to do as Zambia. And certainly that would be a sentiment shared by many of our African potential business partners. So given that that is what we know, the free trade agreement may well create this level of unhappiness. As I said, we experienced exactly the same thing in the meeting with the Zambians this morning. We then need to understand what are these things that we all need to work towards in ensuring that we are going to do. We speak at all times that South Africa faces its challenges. So even though South Africa is a developing economy and our GDP per capita supposedly is higher than many African countries, the truth of the matter is that South Africa is a country of two worlds. You've got the poor Black community mostly, and then you've got a more affluent white community on the other side. So when you take the numbers and you say the size of my GDP is more than $450 billion, and I divide that by the size of the population, 59, it creates 59 million. It creates a misnomer because you arrive with a GDP per capita rate, which simply lies to you by saying it's a lot more higher, when in fact it belongs, because we have one of the highest, we are one of the world's, if not the world's most unequal society. So you end up then taking the money that belongs to people on the other side, and you then distribute it to the people on the other side from a numbers point of view, but the effect is not exactly the same thing. So the three challenges that South Africa is facing that we believe from a purpose point of view, as I said, people, purpose, politics, and policy, we need to agree as we drive this, is that are we working towards exactly the same thing? With South Africans, we're facing the big challenges of unemployment, we're facing the big challenge of poverty, and we face a very big challenge of inequality, and that inequality is also an inequality that affects women in particular. So we then need to then say, if these are the challenges that we're all facing, how do we work together? Because in application and a lot of the way in which we are going to behave around the implementation, a lot of those agreements, we would be influenced largely by these items that we know are very critical on our own agenda, because these are the things that we're trying to solve for. That's the first part. Is that the same situation with the African partners? And we know that it is, because in many of the environments in Africa, poverty is a very big issue. Unemployment is a very big issue. Even in certain cases where people would say countries like Tanzania, perhaps maybe unemployment is maybe 10, 11%, but what you find that the GDP per capita is very low, low in that, can everybody mute, please? Is that the majority of those people are not operating in a world where they are rising income. So the value of whatever it is people are earning is very, very, so we don't want to be building economies where people are employed, but people are employed, earning and living at very subsistence rates and actually poverty rates, even though they actually complain that they're actually working. So we talk about the rise of quality jobs and we talk about the rise of incomes. That's very important. We're influenced largely from our side by this concept of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because the African countries need to embrace that as a template that is common to all of us. It is not just an African document, it's a document that simply says, for you as a country to develop, you need to focus in dealing with all these things. The good news about a number of those things is that they give us business opportunities at the same time. Let's take a few of those examples. For instance, one of the UN SDGs is the idea of end to poverty. How would you end poverty if you do not build sustainable business opportunities for everybody else? Because people can only end poverty if they earn money. The government can only end poverty through its social welfare programs, because the revenues and the taxes that are coming into the fiscus are much more higher, because economic growth is actually happening. So immediately you know that the issue of ending poverty is linked very directly to business development and to what it is that we can do as Africans. One, the other SDG talks about zero hunger. Same thing that is related. The next one talks about quality education. The other one talks about good health and well-being. The other one talks about gender equality. The other one talks about clean and accessible or clean water and sanitation. And then we talk about clean energy and affordable energy. And then we talk about industrialization, innovation, and all those beautiful things. So I'm not going to mention all of them. So we then have to say, as Africans, we agree that there must be industry. We must build manufacturing. We must build innovation, because we cannot answer the question of why we sign bilateral trade agreements and then we don't implement. We don't implement because there are no projects that support these things. So we can't just sign a document that says Continental Free Trade Agreement, but we don't have a project that follows through in respect of how we are actually going to build together that particular aspect in terms of moving forward. So the idea for us, and we did put up our first slide, talks about building economic growth in a way that is inclusive. In other words, inclusive economic growth and job creation. Inclusive economic growth and job creation is one of the fundamental items on our agenda, that we believe that this is very, very important. And we say that the economic growth must be inclusive, right? So we're saying that to our own African partners, you can't build economic growth where it's joblessness growth, or where the social partners or all the key stakeholders are not actually participants, from labor to communities to the government and everybody else. So it must be a concept of shared value as we move forwards in this particular case. COVID is just one aspect of global risks that we've had to deal with that has shocked the entire system. But there are other risks that we're actually going to face, whether we like it or we don't. And how do we work together to ensure that these risks, when they do arise in the future, we will be on top of them in respect of understanding where we're actually headed. So the idea for us as Psyche, of course, is that regional development through partnerships is something that is very critical to grow the region, because we can't be dominant elsewhere in Africa if the region here is not doing anything. So we need to make sure that we put together the investment that is required in these components that we're talking about, in investing in these things that we refer to as the SDGs, because when we invest in those things, we stand the biggest chance of creating economies that can move from developing to developed economies. When you've got a developed economy, the GDP per capita rates go up, poverty ends, okay? And when poverty ends, then you have that level of sustainability that we can all talk about. It can't just end in South Africa, but it's not going to end in Zimbabwe. It's not going to end in Lesotho. It's not going to end in the DRC. It's not going to end in Kenya, in Tanzania, in all the other localities. So it has to end everywhere else. And to that extent, we therefore need to have a continental development plan that picks up on all these issues that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are talking about. And secondly, we need to make sure that we can build an infrastructure and an architecture where we can identify very clear projects of the things that we need to be able to do. Because if your question, program director, was, why is it that we sign agreement and then we disappear? It happens because of this lack of alignment between the purpose and the policy. So we need to close that particular gap so that when we say, here's a continental free trade agreement, we know that we can sustain it with viable and very clear projects. The second pillar of this whole entire thing talks largely about the need to ensure that when the World Economic Forum, for instance, talks about the 12 pillars of how a country is rated from it being called or referred to as comparative, that we are all going to work together, as that is going to be one of the templates that we have. In other words, here's a template, and it talks about the 4 sub-indices. The first one talks about the creation of an enabling environment. The second one talks about human capital. The third one talks about the market itself. The fourth one talks about the innovation ecosystem. So what are we going to do as Africans to ensure that this is also one of the templates, which is a very critical one? The people who give money, who put money into projects, the people who invest in our countries are interested in understanding what is the global competitiveness nature or index report that your country falls under. So as South Africa and our neighbors and the rest of the continent, we then need to have an agreement about how are we going to come together to drive these are the things that are going to give effect, that are going to give the letter and the spirit of this free trade, so that this idea of equity can be delivered, so that no one is going to turn around tomorrow and say, but yeah, this free trade seems to have been put together to benefit only the South Africans because they are ahead of us. Their manufacturing is ahead, their mining, industrial output, the machinery, the plant is ahead, their civil engineering is actually ahead. They can mix the chemicals in the ground, they can build pipelines, they can build plant and equipment. So we need to find a way in which we can equalize the entire system in respect to the entire continent to build that level of architecture. And if you have that particular architecture, then suddenly you start having a much more clearer picture about addressing this issue of equity. You are not addressing equity because you are trying to be nice as South Africa. No, as I said earlier on, South Africa needs to take this particular opportunity to understand why we need the neighbors, why we need the rest of the continent to be successful. Because only when that continent is successful will South African businesses be successful. A standard bank in South Africa can be 20, 50 times its size in dollar terms if the rest of the continent is successful. So it is a self-interest, or as the Americans would put it, enlightened self-interest. We also need to deal with the risk, if Steya can have the next slide. We deal with all these global risks together because we've got these risks that are coming up. COVID just happens to be just one of them, okay? But if you look at all this risk in this particular big wheel that was put together by the people from Blavatnik School of Government, they talk about the risk of cybersecurity, they talk about the risk of climate change, they talk about the risk of geopolitics. We are trying to pull together a continental free trade agreement, but we need to be able to understand what is the geopolitical nature of the risks that we would face in the African continent in giving effect to that particular agreement, okay? If you start having coups all over the place, if you start having countries where the idea of democracy is not implemented in the way in which it is expected, where certain countries do not want to implement regular elections, where there are wars or civil wars all the time, it will put paid to all the ideas that we have around how we think we can actually build, how we can build this particular economy. So geopolitics is a very significantly big risk. The risk around financial and monetary systems, as I said earlier on, when you talk about the global competitiveness index, pillars, the issue of an enabling environment around monetary stability and economic policy stability, those things are very, very critical because they, in the final analysis, determine the level of success that we can have around that. We've got new risks that are coming up, the Internet of Things, the risk around information technology, the risk around the digital economy and its society, the impact that it is having. I was sharing this with one of my friends the other day to say, the very nature of COVID-19, the lockdowns, are creating new opportunities and they are changing others. Many people are going to lose their businesses. The property sector, for instance, commercial property sector, is now a sector that is under significant risk because what the lockdowns have managed to do, they've managed to create such an opportunity that people are now improving the tech in terms of being able to communicate. And the more the visuals get to be better, people are going to be communicating much more better. It's devastating the travel and tourism industry, not maybe tourism, but the travel industry for business. Because now we can talk to each other as though we're actually sitting in the same room. When 5G comes, the visuals that you are going to be able to get are going to be so clear, you'll speak to someone as though they're actually sitting next to you, whilst the cost of communication are actually going to go down. All these things, and I'm not gonna go through the entire wheel, all these are the things that we need to be able to figure out and we need to pin down and say, we're going to try and find a way of how we can deal with, because they all form the architecture, they all form the context within which we can deliver on the free trade agreement that we've signed. Next slide, Ted. So I spoke just very quickly about the enabling environment that deals with what the Global Competitiveness Index report says. These are the pillars, the 12 pillars that all of us should be working on. The enabling environment are very critical because it's not South Africa who says this, it's the World Economic Forum. And many of the very same countries in Africa operate in that same environment. They go to Davos every year and we all go there and sit there and talk shop with business, government, and all other policymakers. So to have a common enabling environment is something very important, that we have institutions that bolster and support our constitutional democracies. That's critical. People do not want to invest in a country. They don't want to do trade and investment in a place where they don't actually trust their institutions. Yes, people will talk a lot about South Africa, a very corrupt place, the state was captured. The truth of the matter is that the institutions of South Africa held their own during all those difficult dark days. It was the public protector who wrote all those reports. It was the courts who struck down many of the decisions that the former president and his colleagues were taking from time to time. So that's a very important thing. That's not a negative, that's a positive, because it says that the institutions of state can actually work and they can go out, they can deal with issues of corruption where it rears its actually ugly head. Infrastructure, a very critical component in terms of creating that enabling environment, and I will deal with that very shortly in my last slide. ICT adoption, because we are coming into this fourth industrial revolution environment, we are not going to be able to invest money in countries where there is no ICT adoption, because this is the new way now. You need to make sure that the new manufacturing capabilities can actually be applied in a particular place. So we all need to work together to make sure that these pieces of infrastructure, and I'll talk about them in my last slide, we actually put them together. Macroeconomic stability, it needs to be important for us to understand what is the level of policy making around macroeconomics in each and every one of our countries. So these are all the conversations that we must not be in a rush. We can implement the thing now. Nothing is going to happen for the next 5 years if we don't go through solving all these particular problems so that we have the same common hymn sheet. The issue of human capital, very, very critical. And under human capital, the WF has got health as well as skills, because we need skills. And I said earlier on, people invest when they know that there are certain competencies in that particular environment. Again, I'm making this point that we're not only dealing with the issue of trade, we're dealing with trade and investment. Investment means you're going to be able to deploy capital, you're going to put in the fixed domestic investment, you're going to put the plant, you're going to create the manufacturing capability. For you to be able to do that, you need to make sure the place at which you are investing has got the necessary level of competences and skills to enable your business to succeed. And in that particular regard, it's an issue that needs to be dealt with, because it answers critically the question of when do you actually invest? How do you choose a country that I'm going to put my money into that particular environment? Markets are a very critical issue, because again, It deals with the issue of the product market, okay? It deals with the labor market, and sometimes people think when you talk about labor market, you're always talking about labor market flexibility. You're talking about labor market efficiency, meaning that you can get higher levels of productivity from that particular. It does not mean cheap labor. It does not mean paying people below living wages. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that people can be paid well, but at the same time, the productivity levels are going to be high from an efficiency point of view. The markets also need to indicate that there is a strong financial system. Market, South Africa is very well known to a very, very strong financial system. Every time we get to be rated, we're amongst the top 30 countries in the world when it comes to the stability and the strength of a financial system. You don't tend to see a lot of banks collapsing. The capital structures of many of these particular banks, including the regulatory environment around the intermediation of who the regulators are, they tend to be very independent, very, very, very strong. So that is something that we'd like to see in all the other African markets, so that when we do this thing, we do this thing in a way that is consistent. And then the last point that the WF talks about is the innovation ecosystem. How dynamic is the business environment? How innovative we are as Africans in driving a lot of these particular agendas. And then, of course, my last slide, program director, deals with what we see in Africa as very critical. And we borrow this from a friend of mine, Dele Olojede, who wrote about the piece of talking about the 5 lines to heaven of infrastructure. That these infrastructure pieces are critical, because we cannot be building any economy unless and until we go through these. The first one is that we need to build the grid lines. Africa is a very rich continent with minerals all over the place. There's oil, there's gas, there's everything, but what is missing are the grid lines. So we need to have the grid lines on the ground. And these lines are required for all the pieces of energy generation, from generation to transmission and distribution. Because that is a specific area where in South Africa, for instance, electrified probably 80–85% of the time, and the rest of Africa 5%. Now, we're not going to be able to do anything when there is no energy. The investment potential that exists in Africa cannot take place if the infrastructure in energy is not being developed, rapidly developed in a way that is very, very fast, okay? The potential is there. And sometimes, I said earlier on, I spoke about innovation. Due to lack of innovation, we kill ourselves and we shortchange ourselves by not thinking broadly. Recently, we hosted the South Sudanese ministers of state here in Sandton City, and we were speaking at length about the investment opportunities in the South Sudan. And one of the things they said the problem with maybe some investors, they don't see the opportunity, they don't want to be innovative in that. You'd like to have a look at my GDP and you'll say, well, the revenues that you are getting are X into the fiscus, and if you as a state are going to start a big power plant, you won't have money to pay me, because you don't have a market to pay me, and you also don't have sufficient revenues to repay any of the big capital loans that would be taken. And they were saying, we did a deal as South Sudan with the Chinese government in which they agreed to build our entire road system. In return thereof, we would actually give them 30,000 barrels of oil per month. Now, that's very innovative, because whilst the fiscus itself does not have the money to build the roads, there is sufficient wealth in the ground under the belly of the earth in South Sudan to use that rather as payment for the building of the roads. Africa has that big opportunity. South Africa is very highly developed with very strong power engineers. We should be able to take people from ESCOM, we should be able to take them into the DRC. The DRC revenue, the fiscus may not have money to pay, but there are sufficient resources in the ground in the DRC, the richest country in the whole world, to enable the payment of those power plants so that this particular level of development can happen, as just one idea. So it's not because the money is not there, it is because the innovation is lacking in how do we build an ecosystem of people who can come and make sure that we can make these things happen. Natural gas is the second line that we always talk about. Why? Because due to all the Paris agreements that have taken place on environment in the past, our own ESCOM is one of the biggest polluters in South Africa and probably the region. And with the green lobby at this point in time, we need to reduce emissions. So coal is no longer such a productive asset going forward, yet there is sufficient natural gas in Africa. There's sufficient natural gas in Algeria that can power this entire continent for generations to come. There's sufficient gas, natural gas in Nigeria and many, many locales. South Africa itself discovered gas off the coast. So what we need to be able to do is to, and it's there, it's green and it's cheap and it's available in abundance. But what is not available is the infrastructure for the gas lines. So we need to invest in the infrastructure for gas lines all the way from Algeria to Cape Town, so that we can then drive our economies, because without energy, we will not be able to drive these economies. The majority of our countries happen to be landlocked, right? They don't have access to the sea. South Africa, maybe some of the countries on the western side going all the way to Nigeria, only a few countries of the 54 or so countries have got access to the sea. It then becomes important that we build the rail lines. We need to appoint the rail czar who will build the 10 million kilometers of rail to move both people and goods internally in all our countries, as well as intra those particular countries, as well as inter, so that we can move and build the high-speed trains. The British recently commissioned and put together something called HS2, and that train is moving at a speed of 132 kilometers per hour. So you can get to Cape Town in about 3 hours in the train. It's very fast and it can move both goods and people. So we need to commission these massive projects. As I said, there is sufficient money in the ground. Our revenue accounts in respect of our national treasuries may not have the money, but the countries themselves are rich because the money is sitting underground. So we need to find the innovative ways of taking the money out of the ground so that we can build this level of infrastructure that is required. Water and sanitation. I made an example earlier on around the Zambia Trade Industry Commerce Minister, Margaret in South Africa, who also said there's sufficient water in Zambia. There's sufficient water in the Great Lakes region. What is not there is the investment in water and sanitation. It's an area of opportunity, especially as we talk about agri-processing being one of the biggest levelers that we can talk about. So we have sufficient technology to be able to drive and skills the investment in agriculture in that entire Great Lakes region. But what is not there is the infrastructure. The government will not be able to put the infrastructure on its own until we as a private sector come together with the governments, not just government. That's why I said we need both national development plans, regional development plans, as well as continental development plans, so that we can drive this agenda for change and innovation to build our economy, so that we can implement this Africa growth Africa Free Trade Agreement. The last one, of course, from our side is the fiber optic telecoms lines. As we said, you saw it also appears in the World Economic Forum slide that talks about ICT uptake. We are where we are now today in this level of technology, where we need to build. We need to wire this entire continent wall to wall with ICT infrastructure, put in the big broadband lines, put in the big satellite lines into the sky where we cannot reach there, because that solves a big problem around skills and technology, so that we don't have to worry about whether kids are actually going to school. The kids in South Africa were complaining a lot about fees must fall. Let's put more money, give money to the kids. We need a kid who's sitting in a rural area in the hills of Limpopo in South Africa to be able to access the very same accounting 202 lecture that is taking place at VETS or UCT live and in an interactive way, because the kid has got access to data which is cheaper, and the kid has got access to the device. The infrastructure exists for them to be able to access that lecture material immediately without all that billions of money that needs to be put in paying fees, but because the infrastructure investment has taken place, and that will enable our economies to grow at a pace that is higher and at a pace that is what we refer to as equitable, so that it is not an asymmetric growth of economies where South Africa is the only beneficiary, but all the other countries. Because if South Africa is the only beneficiary, what would end up happening is that the other countries will end up pulling out to say, but we created this whole thing, but you're the only people who are eating. So the issue of equity is related very much to the issue of social justice. You cannot separate the two things as they relate to a country inside as well as countries outside. So we need to move to a space and a place where we understand that we can address this issue of asymmetric development, and we can also address the issue of equity And to end, no person talks better about the story of equity than one of my favorite authors, the Indian professor, Amit Sen. And he talks about these three kids who are fighting over a flute, and Bob and Carla. And Anne argues that the flute should belong to her because Anne is the only one of the three kids that can actually play the flute proficiently. So on the basis of utility, she makes the argument that of the three of them, she is the one that deserves the flute more. The other kid, who is Bob, says, wait a minute, I hear Anne's contestation that she's the one who can play the flute, but I'm the poorest of the three of us. I come from a very poor background. My family does not have money. I will never get a chance to have any other toy. So I deserve it on the basis of the fact that I'm poor. And Bob is making the argument of an egalitarian economist. The other child, Carla, says, wait a minute, I hear what these other two are saying. However, this particular flute was made by my blood, sweat, and tears. I'm the one who manufactured it, and I'm the one who actually made it. So I'm the only person who actually deserves to have the flute. None of these three people are actually invalidating the claims of the other, but they are all three of them making very valid claims. Social justice is about that. Economic justice is about that. The Continental Free Trade Agreement will only be equitable if it comes with the issue of social justice, where we're able to treat all the other countries of South Africa in a way that is equitable. We can only be able to do that if we address all these issues that I've now raised, in the issue of the Human Capital Index, in the issue of the enabling environment, in the issue of building the infrastructure, where we unite. We can't develop infrastructure in South Africa alone. We need to unite as Africans. When we say 10 million kilometers or 20 million kilometers of rail, it must be a program where the government of South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, Kenya, Zambia, Uganda, all of them have come together. And as business, that is exactly what we should push for, that level of unity, so that this regional and this continental development plan can be put together. And then we then can resource it with the right people who've got the right attitude and the right level of enthusiasm in making sure each and every project, whether it's the water and the sanitation, whether it's the energy, whether it's the hydro energy, whether it's the gas energy, we can then work together in doing that. Until and unless we work in that particular context, we will not be able to achieve the potential and the promise of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. We will not be able to move this continent from having a number of developing economies to create a developed continent. So let me leave it there, Program Director. I think I've said my part. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Mkhwanazi, for your very informative and insightful presentation. In fact, you know, before you close, I know that was your last slide, but before you actually step off, can you maybe just, you know, close it up by summarizing once again, you know, the policies that you always refer to, the American ones, that I think was finally challenged by Gordon Brown. You always talk about this. And then maybe to share with us that expertise, because I think that's very important and most of us miss it on that level, yeah?
Yeah, well, I think that point relates largely to how we got to be where we are as South Africa, because we adopted what is normally referred to as the Washington Consensus. And I think that maybe at that particular time, you know, South Africa was very worried about its trajectory around economic policy, what to go with. And I think that perhaps maybe the World Bank, the IMF, were putting a lot of pressure on the system and the US National Treasury. So what the US National Treasury and the IMF had done to try and assist the many countries in Latin America who were struggling, and there were a lot of defaults, if you recall, in the 70s and 80s of those particular countries, they decided to put together this prescription that they refer to as the Washington Consensus. And South Africa itself imbibed that prescription, and it has something like 10 points. I'm going to go through all of them, but one of those points, for instance, is that you must reduce public spending, and redirect public spending away from things that matter to things like maybe, you know, infrastructure and maybe a couple of other things that are not making sense. And one of the other things that also it created this idea, which I think is the point that you're asking me about. It says that you need to liberalize your trade. In other words, you need to drop your tariffs. You need to deregulate your trade environment. And whilst you're doing that, you need to create a comparative or a market-based exchange rate system. So South African countries and South Africa could not peg their exchange rate in respect of their own minerals. So as the exchange rate was being pummeled, okay, I remember not too many years ago, I was working in New York, I was working for JP Morgan. At that time, in the 90s already, the rand exchange rate was R2.32 to $1. And today we're talking 17. So there was an opportunity that we missed, because what it has done, it has made our minerals cheaper for other people, but we are not ourselves benefiting from that. And those are the things that were terrible mistakes as well, dealing with the idea of when you drop the tariffs and you are not ready yourself with manufacturing and industrialization, what happened, you started seeing countries like China basically bringing into South Africa substandard goods, bringing cheaper goods that they were dumping. Dumping means when you bring goods that you are able to send into a particular country at a cost lower than your own cost of producing those goods, because you are trying to destroy the industry that you are competing with in that particular country. And as soon as they're out of business, you actually start raising your prices very up. So we allowed a lot of those particular things to happen because we followed to the T the so-called Washington Consensus, which was probably a good document, but not the right document for South Africa at that particular time. So certain of those particular aspects are things that we need to be particularly careful of as we move into this Africa-wide free trade continental agreement, that we do not create the story of inequity around how we treat our neighbors and how we treat other countries. Because if you're stronger and you already have a strong manufacturing base, it's very easy for you to take out the costs, all right? Because you can determine what barriers to entry ought to be there. Someone who's starting up on the other side of the line without the level of technology investment and capital may not necessarily be able to compete with you. So those are the things that we need to make sure that we can manage very properly from a policy and a purpose point of view, because an independent business person is not necessarily going to be interested in those things. All that he wants to do is to go make money. So it's the policy makers who should be able to regulate the behavior of business people, that you should be able to operate with integrity, you should be able to operate with regulatory policy frameworks that make sense, because it is to the benefit of the entire country that the other countries in Africa grow in a way that is sustainable. It is not to the benefit of South Africa that the DRC must be poor, or Zambia must be poor, or Kenya must be poor. No, we need a Kenya that is going to be competitive, that is going to be aggressive, that is going to be a $1 trillion economy. And when Kenya is a $1 trillion economy, it is South Africans that will benefit more than anyone else, because it is our own manufacturing companies that will be able to sell goods into that particular market, because a $1 trillion economy effectively means there are many people who are employed and they have rising incomes. We can sell goods and services to them. We can trade, we can drive a much more sustainable investment. So from a policy point of view, you need to make sure that those things are on the ground, that we don't use the wrong policies, as would have happened in the case of us liberalizing everything when we were not ready with our manufacturing capability. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The Washington Consensus. Look, I'm already getting a lot of requests for engagement. There will be some question and answer sessions when we are done, just before we close, but I'm going to ask His Excellency Ambassador Karega to come in and share some ideas with him. The reason Your Excellency is here, obviously, firstly is because of the Kigali declaration we spoke about, but also Rwanda is such a miracle story on our continent, in more ways than one. And I'm very inspired, I must say, by most of the, especially the economic revolution that took place in Rwanda over the past few years, not even for that long. And of course, President Kagame is a breath of fresh air on the continent, says, all the right things insofar as the economy and the future of the continent is concerned. And therefore, Rwanda has become a very important player on the continent. So, Your Excellency, I would like you maybe, just to give guidance on what I would like to also hear from you is around the role of business, the role that business can play. And this is specifically because Mr. Mkhwanazi mentioned in his presentation that there seems to be a constant missing each other between business and government. So I would like, with that background, also to share, the Rwandan experience in terms of the relationship between business and government, of course, and how that has impacted the radical, development of the Russian economy. I'll give you some time to speak, Your Excellency, and please, thank you very much once again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mkhwanazi. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, loud and clear.
Okay, so Mr. Mkhwanazi made it clear and very comprehensive. Governance in terms of policies, rule of law, is very key. Infrastructure, of course, and human capital. And what we are dealing with now is integration. And he raised some fears whereby maybe with the example of builders going to Zambia and trading in South African products. So policy and regulations can make builders come, but also builders boost the SMMEs in Zambia. That will be then builders can display Zambian products on its shelves, and if they raise in quality, they can also go back to South Africa. That's the kind of partnerships we believe will help Africa to boost. But as far as Rwanda is concerned, in our vision, the development of the private sector is very key. So we adopt policies, rules, regulations, and standards that facilitate the private sector to grow. Access to information, to skills, facilitation in laws and registration, credit access, security and safety, law in terms of resolving conflicts, business conflicts, and so forth, so that the economy is more in the hands of the private sector, but it is not as deregulated by the Washington consensus model, but by the case-by-case adapting to the context, whereby inclusiveness is very important. Small business and big business should interact, and foreign investors and local investors should share cost, business, skills, and definitely capital, so that there's no exploitation or all the wealth in the hands of the few. But when it comes to counting the GDP, people think things are okay, yet there are imbalances. So all of that can be regulated by government, but at the same time, give the right platform for business to nurture, to grow, and also business to interact itself through facilitation and incentives created definitely by policy and other instruments. Thank you.
Okay. Your Excellency, thank you for that. But something I want for you to just touch on before I open the platform to questions is the mindset, that Rwandan businesses had to go through to understand that, they are part of a whole, and they need to play a role to make sure that they contribute towards economic advancement of your country. Did you in any way observe any, change of gears, change of mindset and so forth, insofar as Rwandan businesses were concerned, to make sure that they play their role in the economy there?
Very much. The mindset change was critical to Rwanda in the whole society. It was a conflictual society, an imbalanced society. So mindset change for unity, reconciliation, good governance was very key, so that we could be proud of the society we are creating today, that is tackling corruption, that is building rule of law, that is safe for business and safe for all citizens, and a society that also inspires its people in the right thing to do by innovating, carrying research, and also sharing information with all the grassroots. So mindset change, patriotism, discipline in a country are very key in terms of also boosting domestic investment. And once domestic investment is happening, definitely the foreigners are also interested to come and partner and work on your ground when the ground is fertile. So if every country does what they are supposed to do, policy-wise, infrastructure-wise, then integrate, then expecting that things would come from the continental, while at the domestic level, so many things are pending, corruption or inadequate infrastructure or skills. So it's a kind of dual work, domestic and continental in tandem, so as to boost and accelerate as you wished us to talk about. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. What I'm going to do now, colleagues, is I'm going to open up the floor for questions. There's two ways in which you can do this. The first one is that you can click on your reactions and raise your hand there, where everyone will see you, or you can also type in your question in the chat box to your right if you have any question. Just make sure it's to everyone so everyone can see what the question is and so on. But just whilst you are preparing your question, let me just ask Mr. Mkhwanazi this question now. The issue that you referred to around, basically I want to know, what is the risk appetite that the South African businesses have insofar as going into the continent? Because, you know, it's not Europe where you just cross the border, sign a deal and go back. You know, there's a lot of other considerations that need to take into place. That has to be taken into account. But now, what is the risk appetite? Are South African businesses geared? And the reason I'm asking this is that for many years now, we've heard that you know, a big business is sitting on cash. You know, there's an investment holiday or investment strike, whatever the word is, and so forth. So do we have confidence that business actually is geared for this, and how will business approach the actual you know, risks insofar as investing on the continent is concerned?
Well, that's a really great question, Ronny, and I think that, let me, you know, the time comes that we need to be very clear in respect of how we articulate the problems that we understand are a part of the engagement. And I think that the first part of this is that, yes, indeed, sometimes we have assumed certain things that are not necessarily true when we look at the data around South Africa. And what I mean by that, I'm being very polite, is we've assumed for many years that perhaps when we compare government with business leadership competencies in the context of South Africa, we've made that assumption that maybe there were skills on the business side, that the business people were more competent. We made the assumption that they were maybe more educated, more skilled, more experienced, all those particular attributes. And that is not actually true. That is not true at all. In a number of cases, and I'll make this point deliberately, just to be provocative. If you go to the UK or maybe the American system, you will notice that the majority of people who are CEOs who are top leaders, they don't necessarily come from the accounting profession. They're not accountants, and with apologies to all my accounting friends. South Africa is probably one of the few countries that I know in the world where CEOs, the many leaders in business, are accountants and engineers. We all know how the structure of the academy in South Africa is. So you do a 3-year BCom degree and probably major in accounting and do some economics or business economics, maybe some commercial law and that kind of stuff. And then up to course 3, you pass, you do the CTA honors, you write articles, you're an accountant, you work for Deloitte, eventually you come back to the corporate and one day you become a CEO. Now, when you look at the other systems, there's a lot of strong emphasis on understanding society, on understanding liberal arts. And that's why those degrees are probably 4 years, because people start by understanding politics, philosophy, economics. By the time they go to learn a functional skill, they've had a base, at least a level of a basis of understanding society and the challenges in society. We have to accept and acknowledge that as business leaders in South Africa, we ourselves are in significant need of development, and not assume that we've got skills that we don't actually have, especially in the context of leadership. Let me give you one of those examples. For many years, for decades, basically, our approach in respect of things like transformation, for instance, has always been a scorecard. We want to fill the scorecard because it's a government issue, it's not us. In other words, government wants us to do it, but we don't necessarily think that we should do it ourselves. Now, I showed you a slide earlier on where the World Economic Forum says the size of your market determines whether you're competitive or not. The human capital in your environment determines how you're going to get rated. So now we get rated by international agencies on what we're doing in the space of human capital and in the space of how big our market are, whilst we as business are actually opposing the very same transformation that can actually make us to be very competitive. So if you understand that construct, then you have to accept there's a problem with leadership development on the business side, where we have not risen to the leadership challenge of understanding the context within which our businesses must operate. Transformation is a business imperative. If you look at the ratings agencies, they look at things such as social and political instability. In other words, we get downgraded precisely because we're not actually doing anything by including many people in economic activity in South Africa. So the very same policies of exclusion, excluding women from economic activity, not paying them money, whatever the case might be, are exactly the same things that are causing us to be downgraded. I'm making these examples in the domestic market. Now, why do you think suddenly the South African business leader would have an appreciation of what's happening in Africa and what the opportunities are there, when the South African business leader, from a leadership development point of view, is not sufficiently competent to understand the challenges in his own country, which can make his business to be 10 or 20 times its size? That's the provocative statement that I wanted to make about that. So the answer, therefore, to your question is that we need to spend as equal, if not more, time in speaking to South African business. I once addressed a meeting of big CEOs a couple of years back, and I stood up and controversially I asked them a question. I said, who amongst you here has read Karl Marx's Capital? And there were two hands right at the back. Two guys raised their hands, okay? And I said, who of you here has actually read the Communist Manifesto? And the same two hands. And this guy said to me, no, we read the book because we used to be at NUSAS at Wits, and we're part of NUSAS at Wits, and that's how we. So there were probably 70 people there, and only 2 people had read Marx's Capital and had read the Communist Manifesto. Why am I making this point? Not because I'm trying to suggest business people should be communists. I'm saying, but this is the Bible of the labor movement. Your partners that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, that you negotiate a labor wage and a salary with. Yet you don't know that Bible that they're reading, right? So if you go to places like West Point, which is the American Military Academy, the Quran must be read there. Why? Because you are going to go and fight with people who are Muslims, but you don't even know what's motivating them in terms of how they think and how they do things. So it's not just a question of Afro-pessimism, it's also a combination of ignorance. You will not find too many business leaders in South Africa who have a very intimate understanding of where is Kigali or where is Lubumbashi. That's not something that's happening here. We don't teach Africa in our universities, by the way, so you need to also appreciate that, okay? We don't teach Africa in our universities. We don't have very strong chairs, professors who talk Africa, all right? the chair for African studies. That doesn't exist in many of our, so for very many years and for very many decades, South Africa was supposed to be a piece of Europe lost somewhere in Africa. And when we refer to Africa, Africa is not us. Africa is that place there somewhere, I don't know where, okay? So that is the part that needs to be changed from an education point of view and the development point of view, so that the South African business leader must understand you will not be able to operate in this new world unless you upskill yourself in terms of your own leadership development. You understand your environment and the environment in the continent. So a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of risk are caused largely by fear and by ignorance and by lack of proper education, because people are not aware that we all say that the biggest weakness you can have as a person is to lack an awareness of yourself. In other words, when you don't, not knowing is not a problem, but when you don't know that you don't know, that's the biggest problem, because no one can help you. And you can't help yourself either. So we need to get to grips with the idea of educating our business leaders so that they can understand what Africa is all about. They can understand, and there's not a lot of traveling as well, as you'd appreciate. So people here, when they fly, they want to go to America or Europe or somewhere, but not a lot of traveling. Let me go to Ghana, let me go sit on the beach, let me go understand what's happening there. So we need to get through that part where we educate people. We have to go to drive the leadership development around many of our top business leaders so that they can appreciate issues in society, they can understand the issues in liberal arts, they can understand the issues in politics, and not just understand how to calculate a financial ratio. And if we bring to the boardroom any other debate, people are very uncomfortable because they don't know how to operate in that particular world. I'm sorry to give you such a long answer.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Gwena, I saw Gwena has a question. Gwena, can you please unmute yourself? Yeah, thank you. Hi, Gwena, welcome.
Thank you, Ronny. My name is Reginald Mkhwanazi. I work for Transit Engineering, responsible mostly for the business development area in terms of providing rolling stock solutions, primarily across the whole continent. I think my question runs around the enablement and the tactic of providing funding through funding houses within South Africa to enable some of the African countries to invest and also make sure that they maintain their rolling stock and the infrastructure in a very profitable and efficient way. So what I want to know from especially from the guys in Saki is I think we're all aware about the Road and Belt project that comes from China, and it's supporting the global Silk Road strategy, which currently it's really making inroads into Africa and providing financial assistance with as low margins as possible. How, from a trade point of view between African countries, how are we going to make sure that we don't some of these countries don't get much influence of getting assistance outside the continent, such that we as Africans will be able to trade within ourselves and fund ourselves and find a way for institutions like DBSA, your IDC, to get funding relaxations in terms of the liquid nature of our states, where we find ourselves unable to fund some of this infrastructure and assets in rolling stock, because the rolling stock point of view doesn't only come from freight, it also include passenger services. I want to make sure that we look at those possibilities to make sure that within ourselves, we can fund ourselves, we can provide solutions ourselves and create a continuous trading which builds economics in the continent. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Reg. What I'm going to do is there's other written questions in the chat box. I'm just quickly going to read them out, and then our guests can just decide how they want to approach them.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yes, please go for it, sir. Who is that?
Well, I had my hand up. I don't know if you can see it from that end.
Oh, okay, no, sir, that's fine. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, my name is, let me just get the video off. My name is Mkhwanazi. I work for the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And thank you for the the input from the ambassador as well as Mr. Mkhwanazi.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to start at the back of what Mr. Mkhwanazi said about the five, what did you call them, the 5 lines to heaven. That's pretty much the mandate of the Development Bank, amongst other things, working with other SOEs, South African SOEs, Transnet, IDC, as well as Transnet. So we try to coordinate our work to contribute to the contribution that our country is making in the achievement of both the regional objectives for the SADC region, as well as the continental objectives. But we are doing that mindful of the context that Mr. Mkhwanazi was talking about, because it's important to understand that very well. Because of the 5 Ps he was mentioning, there's a P that drives trade. In fact, of the 5 Ps he mentioned, if you don't have this P, you will never have trade. But he mentioned it as he went on in his presentation. It's industry, production. You trade is production pushes trade. Trade pulls production. Hence the issues around where industry is based, the dumping, closing of infant industries, development of industry. So we come into that space to do exactly what the last question was raising from Mr. Mkhwanazi, to make sure that we contribute to create that enabling environment. Make sure that we create corridors, markets that join people, that join industries at a small level, a small scale, so that we can build up in scale and have processes that bind us together as people into the normative objectives that our leaders have in the continent. But the questions that Mr. Mkhwanazi was raising are economic questions. They are questions that go to the understanding of the system in which we operate. At 4CAG every year, our president bemoaned the trade terms, Africa's trade terms with China. What is that a function of? It's a function of industry. China is the factory of the world. It produces, it drives the direction of trade. So the challenge we're going to have is how we position the continental free trade area as an objective in terms of all those things that Mr. Mkhwanazi said, but making trade a center, production a center of that, and how we develop our economies. The SADC as a region acceded into a free trade area in 2008 in Sandton. We're a free trade area here in SADC, but the terms are like you see in the figures between China and Africa, and the rest of the region. It's trucks going into the region, coming back empty, and all of that. Thank you, sir. That's what I want to say.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that input. I also have another additional question here that asks, I'm not sure who this one is going to be directed to, Mr. Mokgoba. It says, would the future continental development plan benefit from a continental key point mega projects designation? Okay. One of our panelists who's capable of talking to that will answer that. The next question is, how can we leap forward if the concept of ecosystem is poorly understood and badly implemented? In the interest of time, I'll skip the second part of that question, but it's there on the chat box if you wanted. And then, of course, there's one comment there that says SADC is in good hands. I think we should educate the bottom. Can the top change? Change is usually uncomfortable. That's what it says. And then, of course, we have one question that says, now that some protocols have already been signed, what is the readiness for implementation by the countries in the continent? This is in relation to Mr. Mkhwanazi around the equity enabling environment and others. Mr. Mkhwanazi, it looks like most of these questions here are more business related in your environment. Would you please attempt to answer some of them?
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Program Director Ronny.
Mm-hmm.
I think that let's maybe, I mean, I have to keep making this point, and let's emphasize this point. We can only grow and implement the potential for Africa if we have equity in that development. That's a very important point. We can't run away from that one. No one wants to go dump goods into African economies because that's not a sustainable program. Sooner or later, you will not have a bigger market there. So you need to have a big market. You need to have the people in Zambia being educated. You need to have them skills, competencies. They need to have manufacturing businesses. If you do that, Standard Bank will make more money there. So it's not in our interest to have underdevelopment. So this equity part of the equation is critical because the trading and the production that one of the colleagues mentioned are things that come after. They don't come first. The first thing that happens is human capital, is that there are individuals who grow up, who wake up in the morning, they go to school, they gain skills, they can get into some kind of work environment, and they can change their lives and the lives of those around them. Those people need goods and services to be sold to them. So you start there, and that's what we mean by equity. Insofar as we're not developing that level of human capital, we will not necessarily sustain. And I go back to the earlier point that I made, and that point related largely to, we have these 8 countries that we need to look up to: South Korea, Singapore, the old Hong Kong, Israel, Australia, Russia. Why? Because they did achieve the dream of moving from being developing economies to developed. Many analysts agree that it's possibly going to be China and Brazil in probably the next 10 years who also join that club and they become developed economies. These things have been done by other people, and these people have done those things by making sure that it was Taiwan, it was South Korea who drove most of the investment in those Southeast Asian countries. They didn't just develop a South Korea on their own or Taiwan. As a matter of fact, Taiwan has been responsible, notwithstanding the political fight that they have with mainland China, but they've been responsible for driving a lot of investment into mainland China. This is how you grow an economy. This is how you become developed. It's because you can invest in your neighbors' economies. You can actually do investment, not just trade. You are not just trying to sell your own product, but you're trying to enable your neighbors to be bigger so that you can create bigger markets for your own goods there. So if you have like a 2 million market, you can make that 2 million market to look more like 10 million of people who've got rising incomes. So we can't move away from that issue. On the issue of the funding that my colleague from the DBSA was mentioning, yes, indeed, we need to create our own financial products and opportunities. As I said earlier on, the governments may not always have money. The DBSA, relatively speaking, is one of the smallest banks in South Africa. They've got big ambitions, but they're not particularly that big in terms of capital and in terms of their own balance sheet. You need a development bank as well as the African Development Bank that are multiplied 10 to 20 times. That's the size of a thing that you need. The China Development Bank, which does not even invest in Chinese businesses, is just operating globally, has got more than $1 trillion to invest. That's a huge amount of money. Dollars, not rands. We don't have any bank that will invest in Africa of that particular size. So we need to pull the resources of the DBSA. We need to dig up the minerals from the ground. We need to figure a way of selling forward a lot of those particular things. We need to then create larger and bigger exchange markets so that we can actually raise the necessary funding that we need. But I'm saying, if we then invest in a lot of these infrastructure pieces that are game changers in the area of energy, the grid lines, generation, distribution, and transmission assets, we build the natural gas lines, we build the hydropower lines. At some stage, I think about 7 years or 8 years ago, South Africa was offered by the DRC from the Inga project, something like 10 gigs for something less than $10 billion, which would have been a pittance compared to the amount of money that we spent on both Kusile and Medupi in South Africa. And that hydropower was going to be traveling all the way from the DRC through all these other countries. who do you think was supposed to be able to build the transmission lines and the distribution in? It would have been South African industries themselves. That particular project alone, had South Africa taken it, would have definitely created in excess of 50,000 or 100,000 jobs of just people who are building lines. And South African industry would have actually benefited more. These are the kinds of things that we should be focusing in doing and raising the money. There are more than 10 European countries that are involved in the INGA project, and the South Africans are not there. Well, the new minister now is talking about, he's talking to the DRC, to the Congolese, to get South Africa some allocation from that particular project. I'm just making that as an example. So we do need, and someone raised an issue about legislative frameworks. Yes, indeed. And that's why we need to, I said earlier on, when you talk purpose, you talk policy, you talk politics, we need to get to the policy stage where we have this integrated approach to how we drive policy in Africa on these things that matter, that deal with what the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals said: end poverty, zero hunger, quality education, gender equality or equity, good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, affordable and cheap energy, right? Innovation, industry, and all those things. Because these are all the things that are game changers that will enable us. So the legislation needs to come in all the countries so that we have a common platform and a common agenda. It will not happen in a country if we do not solve the problem of what is the regional development plan. And for that, it's three things that must happen across the political spectrum. It's what we refer to as inclusion, because you have to include everybody. Now, if you put together something like a development plan, you can't just say it's a development plan of the ruling party. It must be a development plan of everyone in that country, whether they're in the ruling party or not, because it is a document that belongs to that country. It's a document that must belong to the region. We need to get a document signed by everyone who's a key stakeholder in the African continent for our own development. So when the European Union put together what they put together, it was something that affected everybody. So that's a very critical component, so that when we say we're going to work on infrastructure in water and sanitation in the region, in West Africa, in East Africa, in North Africa, we are talking the same policy. The legislation follows policy. It is the policy that comes first. The legislation implements what the policy actually says. So it's very critical that we should be able to do those things and to do them well. Inclusion is very critical. Collaboration is the second point. And the third point is innovation. So inclusion, collaboration, and innovation, we need to have those three things, because it's critical for us to understand if we pool our resources together as African economies, only then can we do things in a way that is better. It is not always going to be politicians. You know, as a politician, you win a political office because of elections, not because you're qualified in anything. That's why inclusion becomes critical. There are many people who are not involved in politics, who are not even involved in formal business structures like ours, but they are there. They've got high levels of skills and they're willing and able to get involved. It is us who must go look for and find those people so that they are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And if we do that, we're creating that level of inclusivity and collaboration to be able to bring better and fresh ideas that are very innovative in driving any of the agendas but we have to get to the level of project, because a lot of these things are just talk. You know, we have an agreement, we signed an agreement with Zambia, we signed an agreement with Mozambique, we signed an agreement with Zimbabwe and Namibia and Botswana, but nothing really ever happens after that, because we have a concept, but we never develop the concept to a transactional item. In that regard, we need to have working groups that are going to meet together on a regular basis, whether it's on a quarterly basis, where we've got business people and government people looking at each and every project, one thing at a time. As Bishop Tutu taught us, if you want to eat an elephant, you have to eat it one piece at a time. You can't actually eat all of it all at the same time, right? So you want to eat it one piece at a time. So let's identify the project. Do we have a gas project between Mars and South Africa? What will it entail? How do we build that? Because we can run 4 or 5 mega projects all at the same time with different people involved in them. But we have to do this because we owe it to our future generations to do this and do this particularly well. I'm very confident personally about the future of Africa. I think that we've got very many young people. This is a very young continent with more than 78% of the population of Africa being people below the age of 35, and they're dynamic and they're ready, and they've got innovation. They just need to be given the tools and the resources so that they can move forward. In that regard, we need to make sure those of us who operate at the intersection of policy with business, politics, and greater society, that we actually play our role to directing things in a way that is okay, and to be able to diagnose problems, because in many instances we find that our political principles are not matching in the right tune. Maybe they don't understand what needs to be done. We then need to be able to assist them in moving the process forward, so that we don't always sit down blaming government is not doing this, government is not doing that, when in fact we can actually go in there and help the government to move the program forward. I'm not so sure whether there are any other questions that I've missed, but you may just remind me, Program Director. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that input, Alan. I think if I had to have a word that is trending today based on the inputs from the speakers, it would be inclusivity. I think, Your Excellency, when you started speaking, particularly the word inclusivity was one of the most important words that I picked up. Each time you speak, you mention this word. But just one of the questions I see, Your Excellency, I would like to maybe direct to you. There's a question here from Galaxy S10. I wonder who that is. But the question is, now that some protocols have already been signed, what is the readiness for implementation by the countries in the continent? This is in relation to, once again, to Mr. Mkhwanazi, as the question is saying. But what is your general sense, Your Excellency? Because the way the agreement works is that you've got these protocols that have already been signed and are ready to be implemented. We now know that have been suspended. But one other critical thing that the countries are supposed to do is to submit what they call a schedule of concessions. To say that as a country, these are, for example, the first products or services that I am going to eliminate or remove the tariffs from completely. So what is the general sense, Your Excellency? Were the countries ready to immediately start moving on the 1st of July? Or, were there still some hesitations in some quarters on the continent? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. As you know, we have 54 countries with different realities. The South African reality in terms of industrialization and other challenges such as dual economy has been highlighted. There are also places of war and lack of basic infrastructure, non-functioning financial sector, governance issues, corruption, and so on. So I don't think altogether we will start immediately at the same pace. But whoever is ready should work. And as you know, every single country in Africa belongs to a regional economic grouping bloc. So within the blocks, some of the things and the mutual helping of among neighbors can help to boost the continental spirit. But definitely, as we have been signing a different pace, that's what will happen as well when it comes to implementing. But inclusiveness, as you highlighted, is very key in order for those with best practice to spread it around so as to help others copy-paste where necessary, and harmonizing policies on common issues. If we are all crying about value addition, trading on very unfair rates of our minerals, our agricultural products, let's harmonize our policy on mining, let's harmonize our policy on different commodities so that whenever or wherever we negotiate, we can use our bulk capacity and also our harmonized standards as well as our harmonized position. Yet we should also explore and exploit the internal market, because most of the things we do, either it is coffee or platinum, we focus at selling outside. So when will we thinking of those with platinum selling to others without platinum within Africa, or beneficiate it together in a joint venture and get greater value and boost our industrialization? And one thing that also happened when Mr. Mkhwanazi talked of Zambia, countries continue to think as isolated boxes, yet we are talking of integration. That's why a country will come and say, we are not yet at your level, therefore we are not going to trade. But every country can look into what they have as a comparative or competitive advantage for now. If Zambia has got water, maybe a priority should be on capturing that water and selling the water to those without water, rather than trying to replicate builders or something unique for now to South Africa. So it's also important to understand our strengths and weaknesses and what we bring at the table, and where we can partner with others, or where we can rely on others while they rely on us as well on other things. So that's what is complementarity, and at the same time, inclusiveness in the continent. And on this note, allow me to rush quickly. I have another appointment. Thank you.
Okay, Your Excellency. Thank you very much for walking in and for your time, and good luck with your new position there. And we will be in touch in very due course. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for all of that, for your contribution. Now, I see, Albert, you've got a question as well there. Do you want to go for your take on your question?
Yes, sir. My question is for Mr. Mkhwanazi. So, Mr. Mkhwanazi mentioned two things. Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Mr. Mkhwanazi, for your presentation and enlightenment. You mentioned something about, I think you said our partners. You used that phrase in particular. Our partners use the Marxist Marxist manifesto as their Bible. And I've always thought that capitalism and Marxism are irreconcilable ideologies. And so I wanted to find out what you meant by that statement, and also who our partners are that use the Marxist manifesto as their Bible. And then my second question is, you also mentioned something about investing in our African countries instead of just doing trade. I wanted to find out, what does that entail for business to invest in another country? What does that look like? That's my question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I maybe, Mr. Mkhwanazi, before you, because we are about to reach our end now, maybe before you answer that one, can I just check if there's another question, maybe one or two questions? Then we take all of them, then we round off the discussion. Maybe
I have
oh, Tina, yes, Tina, thank you. Please come in and welcome.
Ronny.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Mkhwanazi, for this was a very great session, very informative. I'm from Waymaker Global Trade Solutions, and we basically looking at getting more SMMEs into the space of exporting. We understand the importance of exports and to growing GDP. So I wanted to start on the 4 Ps that you mentioned, and this is I thought it's very good points that you make. And what I sort of wanted to take note of is we've got different trade agreements as South Africa. Then we've also got AGOA, for example, from the US. And AGOA is not even really a trade agreement. AGOA is more so the US, not necessarily dictating, but they're the ones who set the terms with all the other countries that are part of it, which is really African countries, the African Growth Opportunity Act. Now, do you foresee a situation, Mr. Mkhwanazi, where, don't you see a situation where if this the AfCFTA gets off in the manner that we would like it to, and it really integrates and we see intertrade between the African countries, it could upset the existing, powerhouses such as the US and China, who are already, are doing a lot of trade through Africa, and it's a big market for them. The other thing that I wanted to add, my last point, I think I just lost it here. Oh yeah, I remember Your Excellency, who's now left, mentioned something about in Zambia you have people that will now feel that South Africans are dumping, but in reality we don't have a strong manufacturing industry ourselves. What you'll find that yes, 80% of the products that they have in Zambia they got from South Africa, but they're not South African products, all 80% of them. You could find 50, even 60% of those were actually imported from Europe or from China, as we sort of said. So I think to round it off, my question is to sort of say, what does the European free trade area, the European trade area that they have with South Africa and other African countries, how does that now get impacted? And do you not foresee an issue of a balance of power, if that's the right way to put it, where it upsets the existing powerhouses that already have benefit from trading with African countries? Now, if these African countries now start saying, we want to start trading with each other, will that not upset the balance of power? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tina. So, Mr. Mkhwanazi, your last bite on two key questions. I think one is Albert wanting to understand our partners from the example you gave on Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. And of course, the other one by Tina, just to ask whether this will not upset the status quo in the world if Africa were now to start trading amongst itself, and of course how this will affect other trade agreements. He specifically referred to the EPA, the European Union one with South Africa, and AGOA. So give it a shot, sir, and then after this, colleagues, there won't be any further questions. I'll wrap up after Mr. Mkhwanazi has spoken. Thank you, sir. Mr. Mkhwanazi?
So thank you, Ronnie. Well, I think that the point that I was making for Albert around partners, and I spoke about, Karl Marx's Capital, the book, as well as the idea of investment. Those two questions that you raised. I think that the first part relates largely to if you have partners that come from a different, or they are influenced by something else, they're influenced by a different culture. The point I was making by who are our partners? Our partners as business is labor. Big labor is our partners. You can't run a business without labor. As a matter of fact, the labor cost in many businesses, if you look at the income statement and the general selling and admin expenses, generally the cost of staff tends to be in excess of 60% of that GSA line. So these are your partners. You need to understand what they think. You need to understand how they see the world. You need to understand what's motivating them. You need to understand what is their philosophy in terms of tackling certain of the problems, because you are going to sit down with them and do a wage negotiation. Where are they coming from? Now, I'm saying that for years, big labor has always identified with Marx's intellectual work and theories. So therefore, as a business leader, you have a responsibility, not even a responsibility, you have an obligation to understand how big labor thinks. So if you are going to have people on the other side, and it's not just even with labor, any other person on the other side, and you don't understand the cultural aspects of what's influencing them and how they think and their philosophy, you are not likely to succeed. So if you want to do business with people who come from a different religious culture, whether they are Muslims, whether they are Jewish, you don't understand what they are doing and how they think about things, you're not going to succeed. So the point really was being made about the need to develop the leadership development skills of our own business leaders so that they are able to operate. For the same reason, they would not have been able to understand why compliance and the issue of gender is important to grow their own businesses. You ought not to expect them to understand why they ought to be in Africa. So these are gaps in education and learning and leadership. So that's the point I was making around that. Then there was the question around investment. What does it actually mean when you say that when you talk about investment? What we mean by that is that the difference between trade and investment is that when you trade, you are just selling things to a place. You are selling, I'm selling you my goods. I make goods in South Africa. I make widgets, or I make cell phones. I make cell phones in South Africa, and then I sell them to you in Kenya. Effectively, I'm not basically allowing Kenya as a market to have its own manufacturing capability. So if I'm trading, I'm simply making goods in South Africa and I'm selling them into another market. But if I'm investing, in other words, I'm putting the capital on the ground in Kenya, I actually am the person who opens the manufacturing plant that is actually going to make those particular components that are going to go into a cell phone. I'm the one who's actually building I'm the person who's going to build I'm going to be the person who's going to build the tomato sauce processing plant, because I'm doing that myself. So when we talk about investment, we mean that goes with me investing capital, putting in the plant and the equipment, creating jobs in that particular country, and making my product there in whatever area of business, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's industry. So I can open a plant and actually start manufacturing there. So that's what we're referring to in the context of investing. And then there was a question that related to I think those were the last questions, Ronny, if I dealt with AGOA and the likely attitude of either the Americans or the Europeans in whether, when we succeed in the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, is that not necessarily going to upset the existing arrangements. Now, you need to recall what I mentioned earlier on was that, okay, let's take AGOA, for instance, as a case in point. Those who are not aware what it is, it's the Africa Growth Opportunities Act, where African countries are able to export goods manufactured in South Africa into the United States duty-free. The people who've taken the biggest advantage of that opportunity in South Africa in particular have been the big car manufacturers, BMW, Ford, and all those things. I talked to Jeff Nemeth, who's the CEO and president of Ford Motor Corporation in Africa all the time. And he says that I make the Ford cars here in South Africa, which I export to the United States duty-free. And yet 60% of the inputs that go into the Ford, South Africa is still exporting, is still importing, so to speak. So it's more of an opportunity. It's not a negative, because what the Americans were trying to do, they were trying to assist those countries that were showing promise in terms of the values that may well be aligned with American values from, I think, constitutional democracy, strong institutions point of view to develop. This is not the first time that the Americans have done that. These countries that I mentioned that have moved from developing to developed economies, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, these are the countries that used to be referred to as the Asian tigers. They themselves had similar arrangements with the United States to drive their own development by being assisted so that they can be able to build export markets into the United States duty-free. So no, a success of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is not likely to have a negative impact on the Americans, because the Americans are buying from us. And according to them, they are subsidizing our goods purely because they don't charge us any import duty. The fight that Donald Trump has been having with China is largely about the fact that China is selling more goods into the United States, but not buying enough from the United States. They don't have a free trade agreement. They don't have a subsidized trade agreement of any sort, but I'm saying that the argument is more about the balance of payments, the surplus, the trade surplus, that you are buying more from me, I'm buying more from you, you're not buying anything from me, so we need to sort that particular problem. So we don't expect that should have any impact in respect of the success. Similarly with the Europeans, they are not selling as much. They are selling. France is selling a lot into African economies, but that's the nature of competition, that if African economies themselves begin to grow, it's not less business that will be done. It will be more business that will be done. If Cote d'Ivoire's economy becomes a $1 trillion economy, France will benefit more. They're not going to benefit less. So economies are like that. If you look at what is happening in Southeast, what has happened in Southeast Asia all this time, and what is happening currently now, 650 million people in the ASEAN countries, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, and all those places, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, you will notice that there's a huge growth that is taking place. They themselves have put together a free trade agreement amongst themselves as the 10 ASEAN countries that I've just mentioned now. And what is happening there is that it's Europe and America and Asia, the other Asian countries out of ASEAN, who are benefiting more from the big push that is taking place in all these big economies, developing economies like Vietnam. And they themselves are excited about the prospect of what's going to happen there. Because it's always going to be the big banks who are in these Western countries that are going to benefit more from a country that is developing. Because now I can sell more products. Apple is going to be able to sell more phones. Everybody else wins when everyone else is actually developing, because it's not a competition. If we build African economies, we're not actually competing with anyone. We are actually creating products so we can sell it to those particular markets, and we can sell product to ourselves. Right now, the latent market is the potential market that is asleep. There are more than 1.2 billion people in Africa, and we don't have very high incomes. In other words, there are almost 600 million people who are not in any economic activity that is viable. So if you create that opportunity via the free trade agreement, it means everyone is actually going to win. No one is actually going to feel threatened. Many of these countries will want to come down to Africa to do business and to create more plant and all these things. I think I've dealt with most of them to my recollection, Ronny.
Okay, yes, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Mkhwanazi. And colleagues, thank you very much. Can we please give our panelists a round of applause? I know your kids will be thinking what's going on with daddy or mommy there, but yeah, it's very okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Mkhwanazi. It's always a wonderful, opportunity to listen to you. I personally enjoy listening to you immensely. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contribution. And I'm confident that this is the beginning of many more sessions we will have to educate our business people, as we've mentioned. I personally, colleagues, as I've mentioned, am very passionate about issues of trade. I believe that trade is the quickest way out of the ghetto, and it is only through that kind of, attention and actioning as business leaders that we will be able to overcome the challenges that our continent faces. And let's start to be more outward rather than inward looking as a society. So thank you very much, colleagues. If you have any further questions, I've sent you my email address. Be at liberty to send questions, and we will continue our discussion into the future. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening. Apologies to your kids and your families for stealing you from them for this moment, but we truly appreciate it. God bless. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Well done to you too.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues. This is officially the end of our webinar. Have a great evening. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Well done.
Ronaldo, maybe you can hold on before you go. I saw something I'd just like to answer you on it, yeah? Okay. Thank you so much, colleagues. Much appreciated. Okay, thank you. I see we still have, a few people. But Ronaldo, sorry, there's a question you asked about migration. It's a very important question. And you can imagine, the politicians are always avoiding this question because this is the make or break of any trade agreement, right? Because what happens now is that if you are now suddenly saying that there's a free movement of people, because remember, free trade means a free movement of people, goods, and services. Now, the people one has not been finalized yet because there is a very serious political issue, because you can imagine if you just suddenly say, you are now opening up migration on the continent, most people would want to take advantage of that, and then you suddenly lose control of your borders. So there is an issue I believe is going to take very long to resolve. I think you notice that in terms of the protocols that have been approved, they've approved goods and services, and we have approved, the agreement. And the most critical ones, controversial ones, or the ones that make people fight, have not been approved yet. So you can imagine one that is intellectual property, very critical, still it's going to be part of phase 2 in the negotiations. Competition policy, very critical, it's going to be part of the second phase of the negotiations. And of course, issues of rules of origin, because that also goes with migration, right? Where does the product come from? How do you know it's a South African product and all of that? So those are the most controversial things. So I foresee, this process now as it is, having unfolded, to clearly just be for goods and services, and maybe that will be the case for the next few years before we can actually talk to the difficult issues. So typically that's how they deal with the stuff in trade-related matters. They avoid the people issues and focus more on the movement of goods and services. So thank you, Ronaldo. Listen, man, if you want, I'm a member of the Randburg Chamber, this is what we like to do for the chambers. So if you or you feel that your members need anything in relation to this, please get in touch with me. We are able to arrange a session specifically for your members. We can talk about how we cover costs and stuff like that. But the idea now is that because we've gone digital, we wouldn't want to, we want people to have, critical information so they can use on their daily basis. So if you feel that there's something you guys need, get in touch with us. If you want assistance with us helping you set up your webinar for your members, we're more than happy to do that for you. So please stay in touch, Ronaldo. And the next time when I'm in the Vrystaat, I'll certainly look out for you. Please do drop me your details on my email. I've sent it through already, and we'll take it from there. Yeah. You are okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's right. Now, I wanted to actually ask that particular question to the honorable gentleman that was there, but he left before I could pose my question.
Oh, I see. Yes, he would have been the most relevant,
Yeah, and the corporate governance that obviously comes in there as well. But there will be more opportunities for us to speak about it. I actually enjoy more the corporate governance side of it and understanding, because people sometimes skip that sensitive part, and that is what throws the deal off at the end of the day. And people don't always understand that. But okay, we'll have a communication via emails. Okay.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Ronaldo. Thank you for your time. Truly appreciate it. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Ronaldo. Bye. Ali, can you please, I see my colleague Nompumelelo is still on. Okay. Maybe we just need to get out of here. Thank you so much, Ali. Let's chat offline then, yeah?
All right. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Sure.